Hello and welcome to
Wednesday's Night Out.
with your host Joseph, Turnpike Plaza 365 Rec Squad. Quotes that will change your life. A curated collection of mind-blowing wisdom. Edited by Russ Kick. Reality, truth, and such things. The opposite of a true statement is a false statement. But the opposite of a profound truth may well be another profound truth. Niels Bohr, paraphrased. The Dive from Clausen's Pier and Packer. Chapter 3. The next day was Saturday, and after my shower, I made my way up to the farmer's market. The huge square surrounding the high domed state capitol was lined with vendors' stalls, and there were pickup trucks everywhere, their beds still full of lettuces, beans, basil, eggplants, zucchinis, of crates of clover, honey, and flats of marigolds. I walked and looked. The same farmers came summer after summer, and I saw kids who'd hung back last year making change while their parents worked behind them, unloading vegetables or resting for a minute under the shade of a big vinyl umbrella. I passed a smoked trout stand, a stand selling nothing but deep green broccoli. Then I came to a stand of sour cherries, cartoon upon cartoon jammed together on a folding table, and I stopped in my tracks. Mike loved cherry pie, but it was Rooster who had a thing about it, the pinnacle of pie, he always said. Sour cherries had a short season, but at least once a summer a van load from Michigan showed up at the farmer's market, and I bought enough for a couple pies. A small group of us would skip dinner that night and gather for dessert on my second story porch instead. Sweet vanilla ice cream, turning the cooked cherries the exact pink of bubblegum. Perfect, Rooster would sigh. And for a while, the only sound would be of forks scraping plates. Then last summer, make three, Rooster said, or four. Couldn't you squeeze one? Mike and I had run into him at Coffee Connection, and he'd come up to the farmer's market with us and spotted the cherry stand right off. I said I'd make an extra for him to take home, and I bought a huge number of cherries, quarts of them. Then headed for my apartment while he and Mike went to help Mike's father with some painting. When they showed up a few hours later, I was still pitting, slicing open cherry after cherry, and pulling the stone out with the tip of my finger, my hands crimson. And Rooster was horrified. It had somehow never occurred to him that removing the pits was work. He couldn't believe how long it had taken. I had no idea, he kept saying. And that evening, eating slabs of pie with me and Mike and Jamie, he kept pausing to thank me. I was touched and completely unprepared for what happened next. About a month later, he came over by himself one evening and handed me a little paper bag, a sheepish grin on his face as he said, "I got you a present, well, us, for next year." And inside the bag was a small metal thing that looked a little like a nutcracker, a cherry pitter he'd opened from a catalog. "Don't thank me," he said. "Thank you." Now it was next year. A line had formed already. At least half a dozen people waited to buy cherries. I looked at the front. I looked at the fruit, round and red and gleaming in the sun, and I wondered, would Rooster happen by today and wonder if I'd seen them too? Would he think of the unused cherry pitter in my kitchen drawer? Would he wonder if I'd ever use it now? I'd seen him at the hospital yesterday, both of us awkward after the evening on the terrace with Stu, and for a moment I thought of joining the line and buying just enough for one small pie. I continued around the plaza, stopping for some lettuce, then went home for my car and drove to my mother's. She came to the door in her weekend uniform, a chambray shirt tucked into khakis, laced up moccasins on her feet. Behind her, the house was shadowy. The living room with its north-facing windows, the narrow staircase up to the second floor. "Honey," she said. "Hi, I didn't expect you." I'd stopped at a bakery and I held up the bag. "I brought muffins, but if you've already eaten." "No, not really." I knew she had. Her reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck, a sure sign that she'd already finished breakfast and started on her weekend paperwork. It had been 5 years since I'd lived there, but after the accident, I'd spent several nights, so I even knew what she'd had for breakfast. Bran flakes with skim milk and coffee made 3/4 decaf. In the pantry, there'd been half a dozen identical boxes of cereal, several bags of pasta, a stack of canned tuna at least a foot high. She was a creature of habit. She took a step backward, opening the door wider. "It's your house, too," she always said. but I couldn't help feeling it wasn't. I stepped in and followed her to the kitchen. I'd seen her at the hospital a few days ago, but she'd had her hair cut since then, and it looked bristly from the back, spiked with more gray than I'd have thought. She worked long hours as a therapist at Student Health. On weekends, she holed up in a little room off her bedroom and jotted down notes into fuller accounts of each session. From the kitchen table, I watched as she filled her coffee maker with cold water, then opened the freezer and reached for the coffee bag that contained her special mix. Mom, I need the real thing this morning. She smiled over her shoulder. Okay, but it'll be on your conscience if I end up with the shakes all day. She got a different bag and started the coffee, then sat opposite me. I pushed the muffins toward her. These look these look sinful, she said. What kind are they? Carrot. But don't worry, I got the ones that were only half butter. Well, in that case, I broke off a piece of mine and put it in my mouth. The crunchy top edge that Mike loved. In my apartment, there was often a little white bag containing 2 or 3 muffin carcasses, just the bottoms of their plated paper skins, pleated, pleated paper skins. No news? She said. I shook my head. No news, no hope, no nothing. She reached across the table and patted my hand. I looked away, and my glance fell on the curtains over the sink, made of tired, off-white muslin. I said, I have to tell you something. A furrow appeared on the bridge of her nose, and she looked at me quizzically. I was sure she thought it was something to do with Mike. You need new curtains, I said. In here, in the upstairs bathroom and in your office. Have you looked at your curtains lately? They're dingy. Her face relaxed into a smile, but I could see she didn't have a clue where I was headed. And she said, and I was thinking I'd make new ones for you. If you're not too busy, we could go get fabric right now. She lifted her coffee and took a sip, then set the cup down deliberately. That's a nice offer, she said. But don't you think you've got enough on your hands already? I didn't want to think about what I had on my mind, and I looked away. In my peripheral vision, I saw her lift her cup for another sip, then set it down again. New curtains would be nice, she said. I turned back. Really? I accept. We finished our muffins and coffee and measured the windows, then got into her car and drove out to one of the big fabric houses on the far side of town. It was a place I hadn't been with her since I'd gotten my driver's license, and seeing it through someone else's eyes made me overly aware of the unpleasant aspects. The bright lights, the vastness, the smell of sizing. There were aisles and aisles of fabric, boats and boats of it, cottons and rayons and wools, shiny Aztecs for lining. Near the entrance, a display of 4th of July fabrics occupied a prominent position with over a dozen different combinations of stars and stripes. I never understood seasonal fabrics. The urge to make yourself a shirt strewn with candy corn for Halloween, a set of leprechaun print napkins for a St. Patrick's Day party. When I made something, I thought of longevity, how the hours I put into it would yield me an exponential number of wearing hours. Never mind the question of taste. We made our way to the back hall where the home furnishing fabrics hung on giant rolls. Right away, she picked a stripe for her office and a tiny flower print for the upstairs bathroom, but she was less sure about the kitchen. Maybe this one with the fruit, she said. Do you like it? Sure. I went by the mayor's last night, she added casually. I'd been fingering a flowered chintz, but now I let it go. I felt stricken, hating the idea of her discussing me with Mrs. Mayer. You did? I took down a casserole. I smiled. Did you try to pass it off as homemade? Very funny. It was. She was watching me, her head tilted slightly. It seemed she was trying to decide whether or not to tell me something. What? I said. I think she's concerned about you, that you're writing him off, although she didn't put it that way. I thought of Mrs. Mayer's pale face, the watchful way she'd looked at me over tea the other morning. I tried to focus on the fabric. For a moment, sewing seemed like the of saddest of enterprises. A world of hope embodied in the clean rolls of fabric, when all you really get would be a new slip cover, a new throw pillow, or a new throw pillow for your same old bed. Are you? My mother said carefully, and I wondered what she was thinking. If somewhere deep inside she was hoping I was, not writing him off maybe, but thinking of some kind of ending. I never thought she wholly approved of my settling with anyone so early. She never said anything, but I saw it in her reticence on the subject, in the way she was already so nice to him, as if she was waiting, waiting him out. I figured if she did disapprove, was the reason was her own wrecked marriage. Not that she wouldn't want me to succeed where she'd failed, but that she'd fear her failure had planted the seeds for mine and would want to protect me from that. I hadn't said a word to her about the rocky state of things that had existed between me and Mike before the accident. I hadn't said a word to anyone. No, I said, looking back at her. I'm not. I didn't think so. She reached to touch a blue and white harlequin print. I told her to worry about her own feelings and let you worry about yours. Mom, oh, not in so many words, silly. I was a good PTA mom. Don't worry. A PTA mom was code for the exact kind of mother my mother wasn't. A PTA mom baked chocolate cupcakes and iced them with orange frosting for the class's Halloween party. My mother sent me to school with a giant can of of Hawaiian punch. So what kind of casserole was it? Chicken and mushroom. You know cooking is kind of fun. I'd forgotten. Is this the beginning of a new trend? The working woman who still has time for her home? Oh, I doubt it. Anyway, you're making the curtains, not me. I shrugged. I'd finished the linen jacket the night before and I needed another project. Simple as that. True, I said, but they're not for my house, for my home. You're not going to move back in with me one of these days. Don't break my heart. I don't know what I'm going to do. She looked serious all at once. That's all right, you know. It really is. I know. She tilted her head, a concerned look on her face. Do you have plans for the afternoon? Lunch, lunch with Jamie, then the hospital. She nodded slowly. She hesitated for a moment, then put her arms around me and pulled me close. Jamie still lived in Mifflin, the student ghetto near campus. And to get there from my mother's, I had to drive right by the corner I'd always thought of as the breakdown corner. Not once, but twice, my Toyota had died right outside Hank's shoe repair. And both times Mike had come and fiddled with it to get it running again. The second time in his suite, the second time in his suit, because he was already working at the bank by then. It was my first time driving by since the accident, and I gripped the wheel until I was well into the next block. Mifflin was full of large wood frame houses rented nearly to ruin, with scrabbly front yards and overgrown lilacs everywhere. It was a neighborhood where certain houses maintained reputations for decades and wore the Dopers house on the corner of Mifflin and Broome. Some someone might say in passing, and although the Dopers you knew who lived there were long gone, six more just like them had taken up residence and were carrying the torch. I found Jamie sitting on their sloping front porch in a flowered bikini top and cut cutoffs, her dark blonde hair pinned high off her neck. 5 or 6 guys lunged on the second story porch of the place next door, a house famous for the bright yellow color someone had painted it long ago, faded now to a dirty orchard and peeling so badly you could see the light blue underneath. The guys were on aluminum lounge chairs, sitting in front of a pair of giant speakers that had been set face out on the sills of someone's bedroom windows. Gangster rap blasted from them. Something, something, bitch. I heard as I made my way up Jamie's walk. Nice neighbors, I said as I sat down next to her. When are you going to move? She laughed. They're not bad. They'll be sophomores next year, and they just escaped from the dorms. They keep coming over and asking to borrow, you know, sponges. I don't think they're very likely to use them. I glanced up at the guys. Probably not. She set her glass down and looked at me. So, I shrugged. Nothing new. Are you okay? I shrugged again. She picked up her glass and took a long sip. See the one in the yellow t-shirt? I looked up at the guys. The one in the yellow t-shirt was looking down at us. Yeah? He seems pretty cool. Cool? I said. Don't you mean hunky? What is he? A candy bar? She smiled. Just a little smarter than the average 19-year-old was all I meant. Liar. Oh, leave me alone. Go get us some food. Why don't you? And I'll have another of these. She handed me her glass, and I headed for the front door. Inside the living room was dark and musty. Jamie's roommate lay on a tired gold velvet couch, still in her nightgown, the phone at her side, and the receiver pressed to her ear. As I passed by, she looked up but didn't acknowledge me. Her fiance was a Los Angeles was in Los Angeles in business school, and they talked every Wednesday night and every Saturday morning. On the first of each month, he footed her a dozen red roses. In the refrigerator, I found a container of potato salad and a bowl of tuna, and I put them on an old bamboo tray. Then added a box of crackers. I filled Jamie's glass with iced tea and got myself one. They're having a party tonight, she announced when I got back inside. Who? Those guys. She gestured with her head at the neighbors. They just called down and told me. She forked tuna onto a cracker. What do you think? It might be good for you. I smiled. Not that you have any desire to go yourself. Carrie. I looked at her. We'd been friends for 18 years. Best friends, we used to say. Until it was too obvious to too obvious to mention. I knew she wanted to go to the party, but only if I go too. What's his name? I said. I think it's Drew. You think? What I think is that it would be good for you to get out. As long as it's just for me, I said with a smile. I'm serious. She shifted her chair so her back was to the guys. No more teasing, okay? I shrugged. Okay. I looked up at the guys again. Yellow t-shirt sat with his legs splayed, a beer can in hand, moving a little self-consciously to the beat of the music. I felt as if I knew or could guess everything about him. He's 19, she said. More, I thought to myself, than to me. Well, maybe we should fix him up with Julie Mayer. She's 19, too. She shook her head. No way, Julie probably wants some guy with black boots and a goatee. Sensitive but moody. An artist, or maybe some guy in a band. A beautiful face and long, thin fingers. Who doesn't? Where is this person? I don't. God, what a pain. And neither do you, Carrie. Do you? I didn't answer. Do you? She said again. It sounds a lot better than what I've got, a vegetable. I turned away and buried my face in my hands. How could I have said such a thing? How could I have thought it? After a moment, I felt Jamie touch my shoulder. You didn't say that. I looked up at her, but I did. She turned away sharply, and I felt a flash of rage at her. I wanted to prod her, make her call me on what I'd said. But when she looked back, it was gone. She'd completely erased it. Care, she said gently. Do you want me to go to the hospital with you this afternoon? I could just wait in the lounge if you want to see him alone, and then afterward I'd be there if you felt like talking. I shook my head. I don't think so. You can call me anytime, you know, she said, frowning a little. In the middle of the night or whenever. I know. We sat in silence. I was just thinking of making an excuse to leave when she spoke again. Was roommate Dearest still on the phone? Glued to it? Oh, honey, she said in a syrupy voice. Roses, how? How original. You're just jealous. Uh-huh. Todd's boring. I just hope she never figures that out. Not as boring as talking about him. She shrugged. For that matter, why do we always have to talk about guys? That's boring. I mean, here we are. We're smart. We must have something more we can talk about. Politics or books or the weather or something. How about men? She joked. But she looked hurt. Men are just guys with bad haircuts. We both smiled, and there was my opportunity to leave. I set my glass on the tray and stood up. I've got to get going, I said. Thanks for lunch. Will you go tonight? I sighed. Sometimes standing with Jamie at some party or even just following her into a bar, I felt years too old for what I was doing, like a chaperone who'd rather be home in bed reading. I'm working till 10, she said. Meet me here at 10:30 and we'll do tequila shots first. I'll pass on the shots, I said, but I'll come. I stood up and held out my hand, and after a moment, she covered my palm with her own. I headed for my car. I was parking. I was parked facing the wrong way, and when I pulled into her driveway to turn around, I saw that she'd already repositioned her chair so she could be seen by the guy in the yellow t-shirt. The hospital was crowded. Saturday afternoon, and people milled around, big multi-generational groups of them standing in clumps outside the gift shop, lining up at the florist to buy stiff arrangements of carnations and baby's breath. I wandered past the cafeteria and looked in. Get well soon read a mylar balloon tied to a chair at an empty table. A heavy smell of gravy came from the kitchen. In one of the lobbies, I sat on a Tweety couch and ended up staying for half an hour, thinking every minute that now I'd go. I counted 5 little boys with casts on their arms before I finally stood up. On Mike's floor, the blonde nurse named Joanne stood talking to Mr. and Mrs. Mayer. They were at the other end of the corridor from the elevator, standing in front of a glass encased fire extinguisher. I started to duck down a hallway, but Mrs. Mayer looked up and saw me. "Carrie," she called, "the most wonderful news. Joanne thinks Michael is going to wake up soon." "Actually," Joanne began, but Mrs. Mayer ignored her. She'd been wringing her sweater as if it were a wet towel, and now she tucked it under one arm, came and took hold of my elbow, and started walking me toward Mike's room. "Joanne's worked with a lot of head injuries," she said. "Dozens of head injuries. And she's seen people with the exact same thing as Mike, who just woke up one day and were, well, practically fine." "I don't know," I said. "His neck." But she wasn't listening. "It all comes down to you and me, Carrie, because women are stronger. Do you understand? It takes strength to have hope." Abruptly, she stopped walking and stared into my eyes. "Being hopeless is easy, Carrie, and you know who it hurts? Mike, that's who." She shook her finger at me. "It hurts, Mike. You don't believe me? But it's true." Mr. Mayer came up with Mr. Mayer came up and took her hand. "It's okay, Jan," he said. "It's okay." He looked at me, and an agreement of some kind passed between us. That soothing her was all that mattered right now, he said. "It's all right, Carrie. We're going out to Sears now before they close. We'll leave you to visit with Mike by yourself." Mrs. Mayer looked hard at me while Mr. Mayer took her sweater and shook it, then draped it over her shoulders. Watching them walk away, I thought I'd never seen her so disturbed. Joanne came up and gave me an apologetic look. "My fault," she said. "I mentioned a boy we had in here last year who—" "Don't worry about it," I said. Mike's room was cold. His room was cold. His hands were cold. His feet were cold, like on winter nights when he'd stay over. When he came back to bed from a middle of the night trip to the bathroom. He'd hold his feet away from me, his knees, his frozen hands. But if I got up, he'd let me touch him with my cold toes. He'd hold my feet between his legs to warm them. So cold, he'd say, and he'd pull me close until I felt him all along the length of my body. I stood at the foot of his bed. Next to the wall there was a slice of space, a couple of feet wide enough for a sleeping bag. And for a moment I imagined myself moving in, just a nightgown and a toothbrush, and some sad bride for the nurses. We had never even gotten to live together, never even gotten to try it. Why had the prospects deflated? Why had I begun to cool? I looked at him. I wanted to see everything there was to see. His arms slack at his sides, his closed eyes. One tube ran into his nose to feed him, while another entered a bandage on his throat and brought him air. Two more went into his forearms, and under the cloth draped over his middle, he was hooked to a catheter, filling him and emptying him. They even shaved him, although not every day, and looking closer, I saw that it had been 3 or 4 days. His beard was coming in striped by a surprising blonde. 8.5 years, and I had never wondered how he would look with a beard. Never wanted him to look anything different at all. I had never really wanted him to be different. It was only myself who was wrong, who had changed somehow, become wrong for him, for us. The Dive from Clausen's Pier and Packard. Turnpike Plaza, 365, Rec Squad.